Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets need to make a trade to get back into the 2024 NBA draft, and we have the team to do so. Kings, 13th overall pick, and the prospects that make sense for Brooklyn, all coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms, they do apply, Doug, and we know that we've been talking about it. And finally, we got there. A path for the Brooklyn Nets to get into this draft class. The Kings, Dorian Finney-Smith. We're doing all the things we need the Nets to do this offseason as the draft is but a couple weeks away.
Yeah, let's see if it comes to fruition. We've heard a lot of teams that wouldn't mind trading out of the draft for maybe some more ready players. So I think that that's probably going to be something we talk about a decent amount going into this. The Nets have already expressed, it seems, the willingness to trade Dorian Finney-Smith, probably for this exact reason. So it feels like this is going to end up happening. There's a few mechanics that kind of get in the way for the Nets, i.e. price coming back. They can't really open up trade exceptions at this point because basically everyone's over the cap. So like it basically you have to make the money match. And with Dorian Finney-Smith, there are a few. That's actually where it gets a little hard with him because the contract's sort of right in the spot of not a lot of other teams have around this money. Either way, you spoke to Locked On Kings host Matt George, and it seems like this is could be a palatable spot, and there is some money that could be worked out to get Dorian Finney-Smith over there, players back, maybe a pick, and this would be an interesting spot for the Nets to be able to try to land in a draft, which has been talked about as being weak, but there are players that I think could probably be impact ready for the Nets if they were to get into this spot.
Yeah, 100%. You mentioned Matt George there because typically, and we saw this when I talked with Jackson Gatlin for Locked On Rockets, all of a sudden when you bring in the other team's perspective, it can either be encouraging, and in this case it was, or discouraging. You go, oh, wait, you mean you don't want to give up all your young talent, Houston? That's such a shame. We were really hoping for that to be the ideal scenario. So with Matt George, he said Dorian Finney-Smith is the exact type of player that the Kings would want to bring in this offseason. You go and you look inside of their roster from a contract standpoint. They have the money on the books that would make sense, whether it's a Trey Lyles, whether it's going to be a Chris Duarte, who I would try to avoid if I could, or a Vesnikov. There are contracts and money on the books that wouldn't be prohibitive for Brooklyn to take back to get them into that 13th spot. Those are all veterans, non-consequential. And now you find yourself in that top 15, in this instance, in the lottery, looking to improve this roster. And you and I identified not only two players today, but we'll mention the other two we're going to talk about tomorrow, because this feels like anything from back end of the lottery to 18-ish might be the sweet spot for Brooklyn in a weak draft to be able to move up a little bit higher than you would expect sending out Dorian Finney-Smith.
Yeah, and the thing with the draft is, as we sort of like dive more into this in the coming weeks with, the possibility of the Nets getting in there, one thing you'll realize from this draft is the draft gets knocked because it doesn't have like this clear number one guy, right? It's like in years past, it's like we kind of know what the top three is going to be. After that, maybe there's some speculation, but for sure, and you might shuffle the deck chairs around a little bit, but there's like not too much confusion about where it's going to be this year. I mean, whether it's Riza Shea, whether it's Sar, like no one's clinging, like no one seems super high on the very top of the draft, but there's for sure NBA talent in and around this like 10 to 20 range. Definitely. I mean, we're going to highlight a couple of guys today that are close to NBA ready now, who, again, you'd feel kind of sick if you were drafting them top 5 because they don't probably have that ceiling.
Right.
But in terms of just like NBA ready skills, like this draft has a lot of dudes like that. And frankly, that's kind of where the Nets are. That's not a bad spot for the Nets. When they lost this number 3 pick to the Rockets, I mean, if you want to just try to find some glass half full stuff, it's like, they're not going to probably get some franchise level perennial all-star.
Right.
But there's dudes here that can play for sure.
Well, and isn't that ultimately, we've talked about this before, but the idea that, the draft class, it's a weak draft class. Okay, it's a weak draft class. It's not, this isn't youth basketball tournament week draft class. Like these are, to your point, excuse me, these are guys, whether it's as a role player coming off the bench, or rather than the third overall pick being equating to a legitimate top 5 talent versus a top 10 or top 15 type talent, it's still there. So for the Brooklyn Nets, I like the way you framed it as, listen, the Nets kind of need guys that can come in and contribute now, because with the handful of veterans they have and some of the young players they're developing, there's still going to be minutes. There's still going to be roles that need to get filled here. The backcourt is clearly the one that I think we identify first and foremost. How do you look at players that can complement Cam Thomas? How do you look at players that have a skill set that maybe offers something that the Nets lack in that category? And then ultimately, can these guys be the both and? Can they come in now, excuse me, and then still bridge across to another iteration of this team, even if the role fluctuates or changes a little bit there? Pinning down on Devin Carter and Isaiah Collier today, I don't know if you have this off the top of your head. What was the number, like what were the top 2 or 3 traits that you identified for a backcourt player to add to the Brooklyn Nets? Because for me, I was thinking about size, which was hard to come by here, but also, can I find a player that has defensive upside on that end of the floor? Because that would complement Cam Thomas nicely.
Yeah, and actually, just before I get to that, I just want to say one more thing too, because remember, the Nets, like, even like if you know, Dariq Whitehead might get a look this year. We'll see how he responds. Like, the Nets still are really devoid of young talent. So, like, adding any young talent here, I mostly try to get away from like where the Nets are. Fit to me matters way less usually, right? Like where the Nets just aren't at this place in their trajectory where like they should be drafting off fit. It should be drafting off just like whoever you think the best players are. So I do want to say that first, right?
Right.
There are, I mean, short of
give me the most talented. I'll sort out the rest after.
I will say like the one spot I probably would avoid that is center if they sign Claxton, because it would just be pointless, right? Like it would mostly just be pointless. Like the draft on talent at the center position, if you had him, because that's like one place you can't really sort of be super redundant. Everywhere else, like wings and guards, the Nets just don't have enough anyway. So like at that point, fit matters a little bit less. That being said, they're so shallow at the guard position. When it came to looking at guards, it was like you said first, tried to get anyone with size, like any size at all, like basically 6'4", if you can have any size at all. And honestly too, like just being able to like have physicality and downhill momentum was really important. Like they just don't have anybody like this. And no matter which way they go in the draft or in superstar hunting or whatever, they're going to need guys like this.
Yeah.
And so while I don't like drafting for fit, because they kind of have nobody like this it wasn't hard to talk yourself into fit plus talent equals a guy the Nets could really draft. And I mean, I don't know if you want to start with Collier or Carter here after the break, but that's what I was looking for primarily to start.
Yeah, and by the way, when you need talent, because you don't have a lot of talent, it's easy to identify talent that makes a lot of sense. So coming up here next, we'll start with Doug's selection, Isaiah Collier, and how he sees him fitting into Brooklyn and why it could be a nice selection at the 13th overall pick. We'll dive into that coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Gametime. Look, if you're looking to go to a game, a concert, a comedy show, theater, whatever it is, you want to make the ticket buying process super easy, very fast, and make sure you're getting the best prices. This is where the Gametime app gets you all of them in one very easy to use place. They got killer last minute deals. They got all in prices. You can see exactly what you're going to see from your seat before you even sit down on the app. They have the lowest price guarantee. It just takes the guesswork out of buying tickets for really anything across the spectrum. If you go over to Gametime right now, they got Copa America tickets starting at $253. Sounds like a lot. Actually a bargain here over at Gametime. That's Chile versus Argentina. Got some Yankees stuff too. Orioles, Yankees coming up next week. That's starting at $37. Padres at Mets starting at $14 this weekend over at Citi Field. It's all there for you over on the Gametime app. What you want to do, you're going to download the Gametime app. You're going to create an account. You're going to use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You're going to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account. Redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets. Lowest prices guaranteed.
All right, so as we continue today's edition, let's take a look at Isaiah Collier, your selection here. If you go over on Tankathon, just to put it in context here, he's at a USC product, obviously, backcourt point guard player, projected to go 17th to the LA Lakers. So maybe we could say Doug's even reaching a little bit here, but sub 20 years old. you want to say you got to 6'4", Doug. 6'3" and and 3/4 is where he's coming in with his mark there, and a wingspan under 6'5". Hit me with the breakdown.
It's just hilarious with some of these mocks too, because you see Collier, you can see Collier mocked all the way to 10, or you can see him all the way down to 22, 23.
Yeah.
Like this is just, and by the way, this is like where we are with everybody here.
Yeah.
Like it's all over the map with guys moving around the board. With Collier, look, the one of the main things is the Nets really lack guys who can get downhill, guys who can get to the basket, guys who can finish at the rim, guys who can sort of like press a defense at least at the initial point of attack, to the point where they don't have the guys have like that, like a little dog in them. Like, maybe you want to say Cam Thomas does, but even his game is a little more predicated on just being able to worm his way into like weird shots that he just can make at an exceptional level. They don't really have like a speed power kind of guy anywhere on the roster. And that's exactly what Collier is. Like, he's downhill all the time. Everything for him is finishing at the rim. He's very physical already. Like, for a 19-year-old, the body's NBA ready right now. There's definitely weaknesses in the game, and I'll go into a couple of those shortly. But overall, like, he wouldn't start out of the gate, but like off the bench, ball handling, pace pushing, especially if like Simmons isn't really going to be around, probably compare with Simmons even if you needed him to. But like, just in terms of physicality, overall speed, ability to get to the rim, and just enough requisite size coming out, I think it's like he would fit it. Like, he could play probably day one, right? Just because the Nets don't have enough guys. Like, they just don't have a guy that they can bring off the bench to do this stuff. And so even from that standpoint, and I think it's like NBA good enough regardless.
Right.
So I'm not usually a guy, and you'll see with Cody Williams tomorrow, I'm not usually a guy that likes to pigeonhole into like 1s and 5s unless I think those guys are awesome, because it's just hard to pair later, right? Like, it's just hard. Right. It's just hard to pair if you have deficiencies in other spots. But Collier, I do think, possesses enough of the skills to like have it be NBA ready now, that I'm a little less worried about it than I would be in other situations, which I for sure have been in the past.
Yeah, and coming in 205 at least by Tankathon in terms of weight, so has a little bit of bulk behind him. I like the.
He's strong. He's strong.
Yeah.
Guys bounce off him when he gets into the lane. Like, he has NBA strength.
And you mentioned only being 19 years old. When we get to my guy, there's a little bit of an age factor, certainly going in the wrong way potentially. But I do like your initial premise of, we know, like, the Nets lack physicality. You mentioned Ben Simmons, but it's like, even right now, okay, Dennis Schroeder is going to be the other guy in this backcourt. We know that Dennis Schroeder is, paper thin, and you still like his skill set, his veteran experience. So having a player that maybe can play off of him as well, thinking about a guy that can get the ball in his hands and drive and penetrate the lane with the ability to be physically finishing at the rim, as opposed to other players, as we've seen number of times, any player, regardless of position, that just gets swallowed up in by a defense around the basket, right? That just can't overmatch the physicality that teams can put forth on them. So I like that premise. But then if we swing it the other way, what are the deficiencies inside of his game that you'd say this is why he's not starting day one, even on the Brooklyn Nets?
Well, he has to get better at shooting. Like, so the catch and shoot stuff is okay, which is encouraging. But if you're a point guard, like, you're just not going to be in tons of catch and shoot situations. You're going to be more, I mean, you might be if you play with like LeBron, but in other spots, you're just not. If you're the primary ball handler, you're going to need to, put a lot of your shot creation sort of off the bounce, guys coming under you on pick and roll. And you need to be able to really attack that in a way where guys can't come under, because then you can just shoot over. And like, he's just probably not at this point a good enough shooter. The form is a little funky. The efficiency numbers were, I wouldn't say, alarming, but not good. Yeah. Like, the catch and shoot stuff at the college level was okay. It was like the shot creation for himself that wasn't at the rim is where you see the efficiency dip down a lot. And at the NBA level, like, you just if you're the point guard, you just have to be able to hit those shots. Because if you don't, and we've seen this many times, if you can't hit those shots, it becomes much, much easier to defend you. Yeah. So the shooting will have to get better. The free throw rate was like bad, 67%. And that's pretty bad for a guard, right? And so when you're not really hitting and that's what I mean about like sort of the form could use some doctoring, and that's where like the off the bounce stuff doesn't come in. It's like, well, you also can't hit the free throws, and that's just right. That's for sure problematic. After watching the decent amount of tape, I think that's probably correctable. And he projects like a hard worker. And I hate to like use that as a litmus test for whether or not you can change. But if you can work hard, like you can work hard in all areas, right?
Yeah.
So like you can work hard on physicality. You can also just work hard in getting your shot corrected. And
Yeah.
so I think that like when you have that as part of your core mentality, I'm a little more encouraged that it can shift. But a point guard who can't really shoot, can't create his own shot from outside the restricted area has limitations on his game. But again, like no one's gonna be perfect here. If he was 6'6" and could shoot threes, he'd be the number one pick. So like it's like this is sort of like what we're talking about.
There's a reason why at the 13th overall pick in a perceived weak draft class, we're not talking about quote unquote the perfect prospects. I think that would be my biggest drawback on him coming in. Now at 19, again, it fits the timeline of okay, let's spend a couple of years correcting areas of your game while still having a role in the immediate future. But it would be that for a team that lacks scoring and lacks, on-ball creators, I would be cautiously optimistic if they took Collier, because you'd be saying, now, if he can get over this hurdle here around his shot, if he can extend that range with consistency, if the free throw shooting can improve, then you're talking about a player that even coming off the bench has a real role. If he struggles in those areas or continues to struggle or doesn't develop those well, then you just got another one of these dudes that now I will say in his favor would be that could still, hey, I'm a bull in the china shop, I get at the basket, but lacking the on-ball creativity feels like, at least in the short term, we talk about Cam Thomas hung out to dry again, try to make things happen when the shots are needed on the offensive end, because you don't look around the room and say Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, these other guys are going to be able to pick up that slack. That'd be my biggest concern with a shooting deficient guard being added into the backcourt, right?
And this is where you trust that it can come around, right?
Yeah.
Like if you trust that it can come around,
That's why the age matters.
Yeah, if you trust that it can come around, then you probably hit on something. If you don't, then you are stuck with probably just a guy that's just a little too one-dimensional, and probably can carve out NBA minutes for himself, but it's just not going to be at like the super high end, and that's the only thing.
Doug, coming up here in a second, let's talk about NBA pedigree, and let's take a little trip out to Providence. We're going to talk about Devin Carter and why he, out of these two, I make the very strong case, would be the better option for the Brooklyn Nets at the 13th overall pick. We'll dive into that coming up next.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Look, Prize Picks is where you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game. Just watching your favorite sports this summer. You got one more NBA Finals game to go. You got baseball all summer long as well. You got WNBA too. You can make Prize Picks. You can make a Prize Picks lineup in as few as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 players, stat projections, and you're locked in. Look, with the NBA, it's points, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals. With baseball, you're just getting strikeouts if you're pitching, right? You're going innings pitched, you're going home runs if you're at the plate, all the different stuff that you already know and love about your sports, more or less in those Prize Picks projections. Turn $10 into $1,000. It's just that easy. All you do is download the Prize Picks app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You're going to get a first deposit match up to $100. Download the Prize Picks app. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA. First deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
All right, as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about trading into the first round, talking to Matt George from the Locked On Kings podcast and having it confirmed Dorian Finney-Smith would make a lot of sense for them. We can send back a contract that isn't going to hurt the Nets too bad and are more than willing to give a lottery pick. We didn't emphasize enough. It's a lottery pick in the 2024 draft class. When we get to my guy, I'm going with Devin Carter here. I mentioned their NBA pedigree, son of Anthony Carter, who was essentially a lifer, journeyman around the NBA, never be regarded, pump the brakes here, wasn't regarded as an all-star in the waiting, but all the prospect outlooks on his son are saying, yeah, look at his father and then kind of go 2.0. It's a little bit better in all of these key areas. So I'll start with the one drawback here, which would be over 22 years old at the time of the draft, played through his junior season. So you're talking about an older player coming out. You can think about a Jalen Wilson type in terms of where his age is going to be. The big positives for me sitting in the backcourt, going to the notes here, as I always need to, only 6'3", but unlike, say, comparing to Collier, he has a near 6'9" wingspan, which is what helps him. We'll talk about his defense in a little bit. Offensive defense is split from a rating standpoint, 115.2, 94.5. So the complement on both ends of the court is what matters here. My biggest thing to start is that he feels like a complement to Cam Thomas. If we talk about, would you plug him in day one starting? Again, based on what the Nets have on their roster, Yeah, I probably would, because he gives you some defensive tenacity. His defensive rebounding for his size and position is exceptional. And then we can talk about his offensive game. But just from a balancing your backcourt scenario, could you envision walking in the door day one and saying, hey, starter or not, but significant minutes for Devin Carter based on skill set, age, and what he's bringing in?
Yeah, the frame is super concerning just because he's so thin. And like that is
The old 205 for Collier. Yeah, listen, I'm coming in at 193, and that might be soaking wet. So that's certainly something you're going to watch here for Carter.
Yeah, it's always like a little concerning when it's thin plus older, right?
Yeah,
because
that
you're
means
like
you're
because
it's probably
you're less likely, you're probably already getting pretty close to sort of like what your frame is going to be, and so that's a little bit concerning. You like the length a lot on him. I love pedigree guys, by the way. Like I love just guys whose parents were in the NBA and you've made it this far because almost for sure you already understand sort of like the work ethic and what's needed around it. It's not a total, pass go, $200 kind of situation, but it's like it counts a lot for me. I also really love guys. We talked about this last year with Pajemski. Like I love undersized guards who rebound really well because I think that is actually just like a mentality more than anything else. And we saw that because last year was like, he played at like a lower level. Is it going to translate to the NBA? And it just kind of did. And I just think because rebounding like that just is a mentality more than anything else. It's a skill, it's a mentality, and you can either do it really well because you're always trying to do it. And that's where Carter, 8 rebounds a game, like almost 9 rebounds a game last year. Like that's a lot for a guy that's 6'3".
And right.
I actually think stuff like that does translate. So frame-wise, a little concerned. Age-wise, a little concerned. Tweener style, like it's a little weird, but sometimes tweener can make it so that you kind of pair well with like a guy like Cam Thomas too, because you have a little more length and can defend it. I don't know. I don't mind this one too. And he's another guy that's mocked all over the place.
Yeah. It's Tankathon had him going 11 to the Bulls, but you can watch him go back 8 spots. You can watch him even go maybe a spot or two higher. It's the beauty of the 2024 NBA draft. I'll start on all the positives I liked about him before we talk about what I think is highlighted positively when you watch his tape or when you hear the way they look at him from a prospect standpoint, but will be a problem based on his frame at the NBA level. The positives are that his catch and shoot numbers from the perimeter are 40%, that he improved year over year at the college level. The really thing that I like is NBA. So he shot 37.7% from 3-point range in college, but from an NBA level, because they go ahead and mark this stuff out on those deeper shots. And by the way, he has NBA range as in halfway to the logo, maybe towards the logo. This guy was jacking it up from all over. He still would shoot it at almost 37% at the NBA level. So there's no drop off here. He's not taking any gimmies at the college level when it comes to the outside shot. I like that there's a balance between what he does on the perimeter, his ball handling, his ability to work into the paint, create a little bit of space for himself. So whether it's off the dribble or catch and shoot, he can be a guy that if Cam Thomas is on ball, I'll find my pocket, I'll wait for my opportunity, and I'll knock down those looks. If you get blitzed, you can put the ball in my hand, and I can go ahead and create for myself. So there's plenty of things that I like about him, including you mentioned liking Collier, a little bit of a gritty guy. I don't think he has the full frame to be a totally gritty guy, but he wants every high motor opportunity. Playing out in transition is good for him, ball in his hands. Where I get concerned is getting into these half-court situations. When you go and watch the tape, I don't want to say that he doesn't have the step because you see him penetrate the lane and get towards the basket well. My concern is based on the frame and the size that some of these athletic determination finishes around the rim become, oops, see you next Tuesday. We have length and size and physicality to kind of force you away from that. Would that be the end of my upside for him if he can't get to the rim? No, because Cam Thomas can go do that for you. So this is where I go back to complementary. I think it can work well, but I wouldn't bank on him being downhill, getting on the back, getting at the basket. If we're talking about half court sets, I can see that in transition where his get out and burst and run would benefit Brooklyn the way they want to play.
Not everyone has to finish at the rim, but right. If you like, and especially if you're small, if you're like a smaller on the smaller size as a guard, like it's not a prerequisite, especially if you can shoot. It's just like, I don't know. It's really just a frame. It's really for me, if I were to like pick between the two, I kind of would just go for which guys might have the NBA body by the end of it, knowing that I can't replicate the wingspan. And that
Yeah.
does, maybe I'm undervaluing that compared to just like the weight and the muscle tone.
And that's the
But
defensive value here, right? That he's only 6'3", but if you talk about having a near 6'9" wingspan, like that's why you're almost shocked when you watch on tape that he can defend and can go on switches. But NBA level, it's the same problem on the offensive end. Is that slight frame going to be the same problem defensively at times, depending on matchups, right? Like
it for sure will be.
Yeah.
It for sure will be, because you get
Switch
switched
on.
into situations.
This is such a stupid comp. It's like switch on to Luka. Use your 6'9" reach. Be like, yeah, well, watch out as you get blown out of the paint going to the basket.
Yeah, and so again, and by the way, it's worth noting here that I think it was Kevin O'Connor. Someone has reported that Carter has received like a promise from someone in the lottery. So like there are teams interested in here. Now, whether or not like that ends up coming to fruition, or like the team trades out, or like whatever it ends up happening. So like, if you believe what's coming out of that camp, that like he is going into that lottery range, like we'll see if he ends up even. I mean, it's a good sign for him, by the way. Like it's a good sign for if, sort of where his stock is right now, if there's already a promise that high in the draft.
And basically, if we let's pull it back a little bit, you can go and watch some of these players. As I mentioned at the top here, you're going to be talking about when we come back tomorrow, you're going to highlight a non-backcourt player near the top here. Same kind of premise, getting into the 13th pick in Cody Williams out of Colorado. I'm going to take a look, I believe, at Jared McCain. There's some chance that I switch it up, but who knows? The bottom line is, from a age perspective on these players, this is where I think it is interesting. When you mentioned getting a promise from a lottery team, well, if it's a weak draft class perceptually, then maybe age matters a little less, because you're kind of talking about, well, who's the guys that are best ready to contribute right now? Because even a 19-year-old, not to put down Collier, it's, well, okay, but he's a 19-year-old in the weak draft class, talking about maybe all the way back to the 20th pick. So how teams look at them, and the teams that pick there might look and say, we want a guy that at least has the defined role right now, and we don't have to wait on, because there's certain teams in this lottery that expect to be competing for the playoffs when it comes to the upcoming season, right? So there's a interesting dynamic there probably at play when it comes to who wants to take what over the course of these top 10, top 15 picks.
All right, always fun to talk draft stuff. We'll be back with more
so
draft guys this week. And like, look, we're just hoping that the Nets end up landing with these draft picks. Like, we want to do draft coverage is awesome when the team has the pick. So
we're speaking
love
into
doing this
distance here, right? That's what we're doing. We're talking about players they can draft because they will get that draft pick.
I'll be devastated with Sean Marks if they don't get there, just for having all this amazing work out the window. Go ahead.
Offbeat. I'll be devastated if we go through draft night and Dorian Finney-Smith is still on the team. It doesn't even need to be about the 2024 draft pick, but if Dorian Finney-Smith is still on the team, it's going to be the worst of all.
I mean, you want to see my eyes roll all the way back into the back of my head. I like that. Just go in the draft night where this guy's still on the team and the Nets on draft. I mean, forget about it. I just might lose my mind. I'll talk about all the, we're kind of out of problems, so let's create some. Like this would kind of fall into that category. We're gonna get out of here. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets. Wherever you listen, YouTube, we're going to climb toward 8,000 subscribers. We're over 7,000 now. Let's go to 8,000. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Nets over on YouTube.
I'm not looking at an action movie as something where I jump around and look beautiful and show off my muscles. Since there are so few people that do this and have that pedigree, people disregard their contributions. That's Wesley Snipes.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We're back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball.